Late summer, 1945, rural Honshu, Japan. The sound comes first. Not the sharp crack of explosions. Not the rising scream of fire. Just engines. High above the rice fields and burned rooftops, aircraft move slowly across the sky. Their silhouettes are unmistakable. For engines, wide wings, the same shape that, for months, meant only one thing. Children stop where they are. Some stand barefoot on packed dirt. Others cling to the edges of ruined homes. A few shield their eyes, not from sunlight, but from memory. They have learned what follows the sound of American planes. They have learned to count seconds. But nothing falls. No whistle. No shockwave. No fire. Instead, small shapes drift downward, tumbling gently, catching the light. Cloth parachutes bloom open against the pale sky. Bundles swing beneath them, slow and deliberate, landing in fields, roads, and open spaces left untouched by flames. For a moment, no one moves. Then adults approach cautiously. Packages are opened. Inside are sacks of rice, canned food, flour, medical supplies, items that have not been seen here in years. The sky, which once delivered destruction, has brought something else. To understand why American aircraft were flying over Japan without bombs, and what this moment meant for a generation raised beneath firestorms, we must return to how the war had brought the country to the edge of collapse. Japan's home front before the fall, 1944 to 1945. By the final year of the war, Japan's home front was already breaking. The collapse did not arrive suddenly. Came in layers, quiet at first, then undeniable. Long before American aircraft began dropping food, the Japanese population had been living under a system stretched beyond its limits. By 1944, Japan's industrial base was under constant strain. Allied submarines had severed maritime supply routes across the Pacific. Oil shipments from Southeast Asia were nearly cut off. Food imports, once vital to supplement domestic agriculture, had fallen sharply. The empire's ability to feed itself had become dangerously uncertain. Rationing tightened across the islands. Official daily rice allotments were reduced again and again. Substitutes replaced staples, barley, millet, sweet potatoes, and for many urban families, nothing at all. Children were among the most affected. Growth slowed. Illness spread. School lunch programs were curtailed or eliminated. In some regions, they disappeared entirely. As resources dwindled, American air power intensified. The U.S. Army Air Forces shifted strategy in late 1944, moving from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks designed to break industrial output and morale simultaneously. Cities built largely of wood and paper became vulnerable beyond defense. Firestorms consumed entire districts. Tokyo burned in March 1945. Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama followed. The attacks were systematic and devastating. Civil defense efforts, bucket brigades, shelters, blackout drills, proved insufficient. The sound of engines overhead became an omen. For civilians, especially children, aircraft were no longer symbols of distance or technology. They were harbingers. Many children were evacuated from cities to rural areas, sent to live with relatives or strangers. The policy was intended to protect them from bombing, but it fractured families and placed new burdens on already strained villages. These children arrived thin, frightened, and often hungry. Fields were worked harder. Harvests were stretched thinner. As spring turned into summer, malnutrition became widespread. Medical records from the period describe rising cases of anemia, tuberculosis, and vitamin deficiencies. For the youngest, the consequences were long-lasting. By July 1945, Japan was a nation under constant aerial threat and growing internal collapse. The sky had become a source of fear, not possibility. No one looked upward with hope. And yet, within weeks, that same sky would deliver something entirely different, because the war itself was about to end. From total war to occupation and relief, August-September 1945. Japan's surrender did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with exhaustion. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice was broadcast across the nation. For many civilians, it was the first time they had ever heard him speak. The language was formal, restrained, indirect, but its meaning was unmistakable. The war was over. What followed was not immediate peace, but uncertainty. Across the islands, infrastructure lay shattered. Rail lines were damaged. Ports were crippled. Warehouses had burned. The transportation system required to move food from countryside to city barely functioned. Even in rural areas, harvests had been strained by labor shortages, poor weather, and years of forced overproduction. Hunger did not end with surrender. In many places, it worsened. American planners were acutely aware of this reality. Long before the surrender announcement, Allied leadership had begun preparing for the occupation of Japan. The concern was not only military stability, but humanitarian collapse. Reports from intelligence officers and intercepted communications made clear that civilian starvation was a real possibility. The U.S. military faced a rare transition. The same air forces that had spent months destroying Japanese cities were now tasked with preventing a humanitarian disaster. Aircraft, crews, and logistical networks had to be repurposed rapidly. Bomb bays were modified. Supply chains were recalibrated. Targets were replaced with coordinates for delivery zones. Food relief became a priority. The Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, General Douglas MacArthur, issued directives emphasizing the prevention of mass starvation. Occupation authorities worked with Japanese officials to identify areas most at risk, especially regions housing displaced civilians and children evacuated during the war. Aerial delivery was not symbolic. It was practical. Roads were damaged or non-existent. Rail transport remained unreliable. Airfields, however, were accessible. Aircraft could reach isolated communities quickly. For pilots accustomed to combat missions, these flights were slower, lower, and strangely quiet. No evasive maneuvers. No flak bursts. No return fire. The presence of American aircraft still caused fear on the ground. Civilians could not immediately distinguish between combat and relief missions. The memory of firebombing was too recent. Children, in particular, associated aircraft with death. The shift in purpose was invisible until the moment supplies touched the ground. This was not an act of reconciliation. It was stabilization. But for those beneath the aircraft, especially the youngest survivors, the difference between bombs and food was not strategic. It was existential. And in those moments, air power was transformed from terror into sustenance. To understand how this transformation was experienced, it must be examined from multiple perspectives: human, military, technological, and moral. Human, military, and psychological perspectives. Angle 1: the civilian child. For Japanese children in 1945, the war was not defined by strategy or ideology. It was defined by absence. Absent fathers. Absent food. Absent safety. By the time American relief flights began, many children had spent months, sometimes years, living away from their parents. Evacuated from cities, they worked in fields, collected firewood, and queued for rations that often never arrived in full. Hunger was not episodic. It was constant. Medical observers during the occupation noted that children showed visible signs of prolonged malnutrition. Distended stomachs, thinning hair, chronic fatigue. Growth delays were common. Schooling had become secondary to survival. When aircraft appeared overhead, these children reacted not with curiosity but with learned fear. They had been trained to scatter, to hide, to lie flat. The idea that planes could bring food had no precedent in their experience. Relief drops disrupted that understanding. The moment food reached the ground, a rule of the world appeared to change. Survival no longer depended solely on endurance. It had briefly been delivered. Angle 2: the American aircrew. For U.S. pilots, the transition was abrupt. Many had flown bombing missions over Japan only weeks earlier. They were trained to release payloads at precise altitudes, to avoid enemy defenses, to return quickly. Relief flights required a different discipline. They flew lower, slower. They watched the ground instead of scanning the sky. Aircraft were modified to carry supplies instead of explosives. Crews were briefed not on targets, but on landing zones, wind conditions, and distribution risks. Mistakes did not destroy factories. They wasted food. Combat training did not prepare airmen for watching civilians approach their aircraft without fear. Sometimes with hesitation, sometimes with disbelief. These were missions without medals, but not without weight. Angle 3. The psychology of air power. Air power had shaped Japanese civilian consciousness through terror. Firebombing had made the sky an enemy. Relief flights forced a psychological reversal. The same mechanical sound carried a different outcome. This did not erase trauma, but it introduced contradiction. And contradiction mattered. For children especially, this reversal challenged a learned truth. That survival meant hiding from the sky. Instead, it suggested slowly that survival might come from it. This psychological shift would not complete in a day. But it began there under descending parachutes. Technology, leadership, and moral perspective. Angle 4. The logistics of relief. Aerial food delivery was not improvisation. It was a logistical operation shaped by necessity. American transport aircraft, primarily C-47 Skytrans and modified bombers, were adapted to carry sacks of rice, flour, canned goods, and medical supplies. Bomb racks were removed or disabled. Cargo restraints were installed. Parachute systems were tested to prevent damage on impact. Flight routes were carefully planned. Crews needed to avoid populated areas where uncontrolled drops could cause injury. Open fields, roads, and cleared urban spaces were selected as drop zones. Japanese local officials were often informed in advance, ensuring supplies could be distributed rather than seized or wasted. This was not charity. It was prevention. Occupation planners feared that widespread hunger could destabilize post-war Japan, leading to unrest, disease, and long-term resentment. Relief flights were a tool of control as much as compassion. Angle 5. Command decisions. General MacArthur's occupation headquarters prioritized food security early. U.S. policy emphasized maintaining order by preventing civilian collapse. American leadership understood that hunger undermined authority faster than ideology. Aerial delivery complemented maritime shipments and ground transport. It allowed rapid intervention in isolated areas. These decisions were made with urgency, informed by reports from medical officers and intelligence assessments. The objective was clear: stabilize the population, especially vulnerable groups, children, the elderly, and displaced civilians. Angle 6. The moral contrast. For years, American aircraft had been instruments of destruction. Their purpose had been to break Japan's capacity to fight. Relief missions did not erase that history, but they altered its final chapter. There was no ceremony, no announcement from the sky, just aircraft doing something different. For children watching from below, the moral complexity of war was not articulated in words. It was experienced physically, through food, through survival, through the sudden absence of fire. This moral ambiguity, destruction followed by relief, defined the closing moment of the war. And within that ambiguity came the turning point, when fear met evidence, and evidence reshaped belief. When the sky changed its meaning. By early September 1945, relief operations expanded beyond planning and preparation. They became visible. In regions across Honshu and Kyushu, American aircraft appeared on schedules that no longer matched bombing patterns. Flights came during daylight. They flew lower. They circled. Observers on the ground noticed the difference before they understood it. In rural districts, local officials were instructed to clear open land. Farmers were told to keep people back. Children were gathered indoors or held at a distance, not for secrecy, but for safety. The memory of air raids was too close for calm assemblies. When the first supplies fell, they did so slowly. Parachutes opened fully, white and canvas bright against the sky. Bundles descended without urgency, drifting rather than dropping. The sound was not impact but thud, controlled, measured. There were no secondary explosions, no rising smoke. Reports from occupation records describe hesitation on the ground. Civilians did not rush forward immediately. Years of conditioning had taught restraint. Only after officials approached and inspected the cargo did movement begin. The contents were unmistakable: rice, flour, canned protein, medical kits. Aircraft returned to the same regions. Drop zones were reused. Supplies arrived with consistency. The sky no longer brought randomness, it brought schedule. This alone marked a psychological shift. Warplanes had been unpredictable. Relief planes were not. Children were no longer always pulled away. In some villages, they were kept indoors during drops, but allowed to watch from doorways or windows. In others, they stood at a distance under supervision, quiet and motionless. Occupation reports and Japanese municipal records describe growing comprehension among civilians. The aircraft were American. The supplies were deliberate. The intent was not harm. The recognition did not arrive as gratitude. It arrived as survival. Food stabilized communities on the brink. Emergency rations supplemented failing harvests. Medical supplies reduced the spread of disease in displaced populations. For children suffering from prolonged malnutrition, even small increases in caloric intake altered daily life. Energy returned, illnesses slowed, mortality decreased. American pilots continued their missions without ceremony. Many were rotated out within weeks. Relief operations became routine, then background. Their success was measured not in headlines, but in absence of famine, absence of unrest, absence of collapse. For those who had lived beneath firestorms, the memory of aircraft remained complex. The sound of engines would never become neutral, but it became layered. In testimonies recorded years later, Japanese civilians often distinguished between the planes that burned and the planes that brought food. This distinction mattered most to those who had been children. The climax of this story was not a dramatic confrontation. It was recognition, quiet, cumulative, and irreversible. The war's final transformation did not occur in surrender documents or military parades. It occurred when the same machines that had delivered destruction became instruments of preservation. And with that shift came consequences that extended far beyond the moment. Stabilization and survival. By late 1945, the immediate crisis had eased, but only just. Relief flights were not the sole source of aid, but they played a critical role during the most fragile weeks of the occupation. As ports reopened and maritime shipments increased, aerial delivery bridged the gap between collapse and recovery. Occupation records indicate that food distribution remained uneven. Urban populations continued to struggle. Black markets emerged. Rations were still insufficient for full recovery. Yet the feared mass starvation did not occur. For children, the effects were measurable. Medical surveys conducted by Allied authorities documented gradual improvements in body weight, reduced incidence of acute deficiency diseases, and lower child mortality rates in areas receiving consistent aid. Schools, where they reopened, began distributing food again. Attendance increased. Psychologically, the aftermath was complex. Children did not forget the firebombings. Trauma remained, but the narrative of the sky was altered. Aircraft no longer represented a single absolute threat. This mattered in ways that statistics could not capture. It influenced trust, memory, and the way the war would be recalled decades later. For American forces, the relief missions faded quickly from public memory. They lacked the spectacle of combat and the symbolism of victory ceremonies. Yet within military planning circles, they became early examples of post-conflict stabilization, using military logistics to prevent civilian catastrophe. Japan's recovery would be long and uneven. Infrastructure rebuilding took years. Food security stabilized gradually through imports, land reform, and economic restructuring. But the immediate transition from a nation under aerial assault to a nation receiving aid from the same direction was decisive. The war ended not with resolution, but with intervention. And that intervention reshaped the early days of peace. Memory, perception, and long-term consequences. As months passed, relief flights gave way to more permanent systems of aid. Ports resumed operation. Rail networks were repaired. Food imports increased under Allied supervision. What had begun as emergency stabilization evolved into structured recovery. Yet the memory of those early aerial drops endured. For many Japanese civilians, especially those who had been children in 1945, these moments became reference points in how the war ended. Oral histories collected in later decades often describe confusion rather than relief, the difficulty of reconciling destruction and assistance delivered by the same machines, bearing the same insignia. This dual memory mattered. It shaped early attitudes toward the occupation. The Allied presence was not experienced solely through authority or defeat, but also through survival. This did not erase resentment or grief, but it complicated them. The occupation was not welcomed, but neither was it defined only by force. From a historical perspective, these relief missions marked a shift in how air power would be understood after the war. Aircraft were no longer seen only as tools of annihilation. They had demonstrated their capacity to sustain populations as well as destroy infrastructure. This lesson would influence later military doctrines and humanitarian responses in post-war conflicts. For American planners, Japan became an early case study in post-conflict stabilization. Preventing famine was not merely a moral concern, it was a strategic necessity. Hunger bred instability. Stability enabled reform. For Japanese society, the survival of a generation of children mattered more than any policy. Those children would grow into adults who remembered the war not only for its ending, but for how it transitioned, abruptly, imperfectly, and without spectacle. The aircraft eventually disappeared from the skies. The fields were replanted. Cities rebuilt themselves slowly, but the memory remained. Quiet, unresolved, and deeply human. That memory invites reflection, not on victory or defeat, but on what war leaves behind when the weapons fall silent.